Hi, everyone. Judge Andrew Napolitano here for Judging Freedom. Today is Wednesday, August 2nd, 2023. Our guest today is Tony Shaffer, and I'm going to ask him what is the state of military affairs on the ground in Ukraine. But first, this message. Hi, everyone. Judge Napolitano here, and the verdict is in. Everywhere I go, people are complaining how expensive things are and how their stomachs turn every time they get their IRA statement. Listen, many experts are predicting a recession. When, how, where, how bad, who knows? But why wait and see? Do what I did and learn how adding gold to your portfolio can help. Now, you all know that I am a paid spokesperson for Lear Capital, but I believe in Lear Capital. I trust them, and I value their products. Lear Capital is the company that I trust for buying my gold. Lear Capital has over 25 years experience and thousands of five-star reviews and a 24-hour risk-free purchase guarantee. Call my friends at Lear today and start protecting your retirement with gold. Here's the number. You see it on the screen. 800-511-4620. 800-511-4620, or use the internet as I do, LearJudgeNap.com, and get your free gold investment guide and learn how to take control of your financial future. Now listen to this. My friends at Lear are offering to Judging Freedom customers only a $15,000 bonus in gold. Call today and see if you qualify for it. 800-511-4620 or LearJudgeNap.com. Tony, welcome back to the program. What is the state of military affairs now? What is the state of the spring now, summer offensive? How deep, if at all, have the Ukrainians penetrated into Russian territory? How much of a meat grinder is this at the present moment for the Ukrainian military?
So the Russians continue to occupy about 16% of Ukraine, I believe, based on what I've looked at on the map. It's my estimation. I'm not going off anything that I've reviewed personally, just what I've seen on the map. That's down from about 25% the Russians had after they had initially entered. The Ukrainians were successful last fall, taking back some of that. And since then, the Russians have made incremental gains to regain places like Bakhmut and places like that. The offensive, the vaunted Ukrainian offensive planned by Jake Sullivan, according to people I respect and listen to, their spring offensive has been disheveled, I guess, to in a one-word summary. Zelensky has not been able to consolidate military power effectively to use it to push the Russians out. The Russians were brilliant in using layered defense. They've put layer after layer. The Ukrainians have never gone through. And also, a fundamental flaw in their strategy is that they have two generals competing on the battlefield, which is never a good idea.
This is the Ukrainians or the Russians?
Ukrainians.
I've never heard of this. Have you ever heard of this?
No. Well, no. I've used the analogy of Eisenhower and Montgomery. If you look at World War II, very strong personalities, and if they decided to let Montgomery be Montgomery and go off and do his own thing, we would not have seen the effective use of military force on D-Day or after. You had Eisenhower as Supreme Commander. You don't have that. So you've got two competing generals. You've got Zaluzhny, who essentially is the commander of Ukrainian armed forces, kinda. He's focused on Crimea. There's this constant drumbeat that they're going to take back Crimea. I don't see it. I don't think anybody who has a rational military understanding sees it, but Zaluzhny is down south doing this. And you got Syrskyi, Colonel General Syrskyi, who outranks Zaluzhny, doing his own thing up north in Zaporizhia, the Zaporizhia region. So what you have now is two generals who will not talk by all accounts, do not like each other. And Zelensky not able to say one of the two, you need to fall in and do things. You combine that with the patchwork of weapons, weapon systems, training. Nothing was ever integrated. So you match the Ukrainian forces, which are outnumbered in some cases 4 and 5 to 1 against the Russians. The Russians have superior numbers, Judge, over the Ukrainians. So when you combine superior numbers with bad strategy, a lack of military leadership, and a politician in Washington being your quarterback, it's resulted in, according to the New York Times, nothing occurring in the offensive. As a matter of fact, New York Times has finally admitted and again, the New York Times is pro-war, pro-Ukraine. They've admitted to 20% losses of the gear we sent them. I think it's higher than that. They've admitted that there's a pause right now. The offensive ostensibly started either on the 4th of June or the 8th of June, depending on who you talk to. But the net effect is no gains, huge losses, and no prospects for any victory by the Ukrainians at any time in the future.
Scott Ritter, Colonel McGregor, and you have agreed that the Russians have built 3 concentric shaped levels of defenses,
yes,
through which the Ukrainians would have to go in order to take back any of the land. Is it fair to say that the Ukrainians have yet to breach the first of those 3 concentric defenses?
They have not breached any of the circles, any of the concentric circles. That's correct. Now, the Ukrainians have made incremental gains and then lost them almost instantly. The Russians were masterful, and I'm not saying this because I'm not pro-Russian. I'm simply calling balls and strikes. The Russians were masterful the way they laid out these 3 concentric circles and used landmines over and over. And it's interesting because every time you see the Ukrainians, there's videos out there you can go look at on YouTube and on Instagram. And it's interesting, every time the Ukrainians make gains, they get into the trenches, they're all landmines. So they end up, getting in, and then they're getting blown up by the landmines left behind by the Russians. Therefore, any gain they make is instantly attrited down to nothing. And again, I'm going to cite the New York Times as my reference point. They're saying that the Ukrainian soldiers are being decimated, huge losses. The morale is very low. And I don't even have to talk about the Russian side to know that the Russians are benefiting from the Ukrainian ineptitude at this point. So,
have the Russians recently undergone the sacking of a series of generals and colonels by Defense Minister Shoigu? I think they have. And why did that happen?
So I think from the beginning of the operation, Judge, there were many generals who were essentially, I would describe as politicians in uniform, much like our generals.
Russian generals you're talking
Russian
about.
generals. And they were, I think, many of them were promoted based on how well they could kind of hide their own shortcomings. And in many instances, you have corruption all through the system. The Soviets, before the Russians, before the current Russian Federation, had huge issues with resources being diverted by corrupt individuals. Nothing has really changed. And I would argue that's why the initial entry a year and a half ago by the Russians was so chaotic, because I think Putin had been lied to. I think a lot of folks had given him intel based on what they thought he wanted to hear, not the reality. So I think this is a continuing paring down, getting rid of those generals who are not competent. War is a great discriminator of competence. Either you're competent or you're not. And once you're engaged in military and combat operations, those who are competent show up very rapidly. And again, Stalin went through this with his generals at the beginning of World War II. Every other conflict I've seen, if you're going to win, you have to actually start figuring out who's competent, who's not. We used to fire generals for being incompetent. We don't do that now, but during World War II, you would have generals relieved instantly if they lost a major battle. So I think there's been things within the Russian system which have been less than optimal. I have no direct access to the Russian systems. As a matter of fact, I'm refusing pretty much any contact with the Russians or Ukrainians at this point, just to completely stay out of everything. And from what I'm watching through open sources, it's very clear that they're trying to pick generals who can actually do military operations effectively over those who have been able to hide their shortcomings and essentially be very much in the being yes men saying
All
yes
right,
to
so
whatever. So
while the Jake Sullivan orchestrated and micromanaged so-called spring, now some become summer offensive, that's a mouthful, is going on,
yes,
the Ukrainians are using drones to inflict pinpricks on Moscow office buildings.
right.
Here's a report from my friend Richard Engel at NBC News. I'd like you to watch this. It's about a minute
Sure.
long. And at the end of it are some, I'll let you evaluate them, statements by President Zelensky, which are translated into English. Take a listen.
Sure.
The drones exploded in the heart of Moscow's financial district on Sunday morning around 4 a.m. Russian officials say at least 3 drones were involved and blamed Ukraine. Russians can no longer turn a blind eye to this war now that it's coming home. Although Ukraine didn't take responsibility, President Zelensky gave what seemed to be the most direct admission of cross-border attacks into Russia yet, and suggested a new chapter is beginning. Ukraine is getting stronger. Gradually, the war is returning to Russian territory, its symbolic centers and military bases. And this is an inevitable, natural, and absolutely fair process, he said.
What kind of sense does it make to be using drones to break windows in high-rise banks in downtown Moscow when you're losing the summer offensive on the battlefield?
Well, it's a sign of desperation, and like you said, it's not having any military effect. This reinforces Putin's narrative, Judge, that Ukraine is a terrorist state. He says this in almost every speech. So if you simply look at what Putin says and what Ukraine is doing, it validates what Putin's saying. And again, I'm not a Putin guy. I'm not a Russian guy. I'm just saying that and this is not about us. It's not about the West. It's about the rest of the world. You just saw this African conference where they had African leaders show up with Putin, and he's messaging more to them than us. So the Zelensky's own words and actions feed into the narrative that Putin's putting out to the rest of the world. It's not helpful, and it's not a military necessity. These things will not help Ukraine win on the battlefield, Judge. These are signs of desperation.
All right. Well, we saw the drones. They appear to be maybe the 25th or 30th floors of high-rise office buildings on Sunday. Right. Presumably the office buildings were unoccupied. That's why I called it a pinprick. Can't the Russians defend against those drones?
So the answer is the Russians have been effectively knocking down, I'd say, 80 to 90% of what is sent their way. Some of these things are very small, and the smaller a drone is, the more difficult it is to intercept. I think their S-300, S-400 systems that they have are effective, but they've had to, like any military operation, learn how to do better. And I think as we see things now, Judge, they have been very effective. I think I was reading something last week about the attacks over the weekend, and they knocked down, I think, 22 drones, and about 2 got in. So that's still a good ratio. It's not perfect, but it is something that they're improving on. So again, Zelensky doing this is not having any military effect. It is simply feeding into Putin's narrative that the Ukrainians are terrorists, and it's not helping Ukraine one bit.
I want to deviate for a minute on drones.
Sure.
If the small ones are difficult to detect, could somebody hit the U.S. Capitol or the White House with drones undetected?
Oh, yeah. So I've talked to a number of my colleagues about this, and your drone technology is very advanced, especially when you start using AI with it. Some of these things could be pre-positioned, just lay dormant until they're ready to be used. You could bring them in via foot, via vehicle, put them somewhere, leave them. And then at the time of your choosing, choose to overwhelm things. And yeah, I see the day where some smart terrorist would be able to do essentially a comprehensive attack against the Capitol, against Congress, against the White House, which would have some detrimental effect. I think of these things all the time. I used to run red teams. We've talked about this a little bit off the air in the old days. And I ran red teams where I would put myself in the shoes of the bad guys. And I'm very creative in how to be very devious, just saying. And, well, come on. I mean, it's true. That's what
Tony,
it's,
we've
you
been
know.
friends
It
for
is. It
years.
is what it is. You know.
All
I
right.
mean, I'm not going to sugarcoat my my semi-criminal background doing these things for our side. So I'm just saying that someone who has the understanding of technology and can actually do a comprehensive intelligence preparation of the battle space, you could do a devastating attack on the cheap and be
Okay,
very effective.
let's get back to the battlefield. I
Sure.
want to show you a full screen in English of a statement made by Dmitry Medvedev. Mr. Medvedev is the vice chair of the Russian National Security Council. The chair is Vladimir Putin, and he's a former president of Russia. Just imagine that the offensive, he's talking about the Ukrainian offensive, in tandem with NATO succeeded and ended up with part of our land being taken away. Then we would have to use nuclear weapons by virtue of the stipulations of the Russian presidential decree. There simply wouldn't be any other solution. Our enemies should pray to our fighters that they do not allow the world to go up in nuclear flames. It's July 30th, so this is just 4 days ago. This is the second time that former President Medvedev has mentioned the desirability of something catastrophic. He once said we would go across the Polish border if necessary. Now he's saying we'll use nukes if necessary. Is this a good guy, bad guy between him and Putin? Is this a trial balloon? Or is this the public policy of the government of Russia?
I believe this is the policy, and he's the guy that's supposed to deliver it. Putin's supposed to be the good guy in this, kind of being open to alternatives. But let me state why they're saying it. Two reasons. First, they've been using this nuclear rhetoric for over a year now, Judge, and they're doing it because they see weakness in NATO, especially in Biden. They do believe to push back NATO. Again, looking at it from their perspective, not ours. They see NATO as a threat, absolutely as a threat. They see what we're doing as a threat. They're looking always for potential escalation. And they've contemplated, based on people I speak with, the idea of just taking nukes and laying them out, 3 or 4, maybe 10 tactical nuclear weapons, Hiroshima size, thereabouts, and just letting them off because they believe, and this is an internal debate apparently within Russia, letting them off in Ukraine because Ukraine is not a NATO member. And if there's circumstance where the Russians really do think they're losing, I think they're going to do it because they think they can get away with it. Weakness to two factors here. Weakness, you dare never show weakness to an adversary, and Biden has showed weakness over and over. And secondly, they think that there's time to make a statement to stop NATO moving east, and this would be a very strong statement. So this is a policy statement as well as a political statement. This is a warning to NATO. It's like, don't come any closer. The Russians have a natural paranoia regarding their territorial prerogatives. It goes back to the czars. We've spoken about this probably 5 or 6 times, Judge. So the Russians have been invaded by a number of nations. Napoleon, Hitler. Before that, there were a number of groups, tribes, which invaded. So they have been invaded. This is something that runs very deep in their cultural memory. So I could see them doing something like this if they feel they're put upon. And I don't think they're bluffing. And it's a very dangerous thing to trifle with at this point in time. I don't think it's worth us pushing them. And I think that's what they're going to do.
Here's General David Petraeus. About 2/3 of the way through this, he talks about carpet bombing.
I think they need to be doing what they actually are now doing, having adapted their plan. Of course, no plan survives contact with the enemy. And it was quickly clear that these miles-long minefields, anti-personnel, anti-tank minefields, tank ditches, dragon's teeth, trench lines full of Russian soldiers, all overwatched by forward observers and drones with artillery on call, that these were going to be very, very difficult to breach, given the shortcomings that the Ukrainians have in certain assets that we would have deployed in this kind of situation. In particular, massive air power. We would have just carpet bombed the whole area of these minefields, tried to blow up as much as we possibly could. And then very substantial, heavily armed, essentially bulldozers, D9 bulldozers that just plow their way through this, supported again by close air support, attack helicopters, and the rest. They don't have that. So they've adapted, I think, impressively.
Is he suggesting a strategy that's impossible for the Ukrainians? Is he offering, isn't carpet bombing a war crime? It destroys everything in its sight, civilian structure, civilian human beings.
Well, I don't want to comment on the legality of it. I know we do it and we have done it, and we did it in Afghanistan. So I don't want to go down that path necessarily. But I will say this: what he's saying is completely detached from reality. First, one of the factors I forgot to mention is the fact that they're going on the offensive with their air. They do not have air superiority. They don't have air parity. They are inferior. They do not have an air force to speak of. They've been able to manage one or two local tactical
Let me
strikes.
just stop you. You are correct that the F-16s, which won't arrive for another year, have not arrived.
They have not arrived. They're not going to arrive. I don't think, Judge, I don't think they're ever going to arrive. I think it's something they've said, that West has said to the Ukrainians to placate them. It's like, yeah, we'll give you the F-16s. But
okay, back to your analysis of General Petraeus, please.
Yeah, so I was going to say, so the whole idea of having to go in with all those weapon systems he's talking about air-land battle in the Fulda Gap, Judge. We trained on that as lieutenants, and he was a lieutenant back then too. And it was going to be a slugfest with the Russians. I mean, look, I think I've told you off air. I thought when I was a lieutenant in the 80s, I thought I was not going to live past into my 30s. I thought we were all going to die on some great battle in Germany facing off against the Russians. And what he's talking about is what that battle would have been. It would have been massive troop movements, hard fought battles, going through minefields, laying down, all the engineers going through, being blown up, airstrikes on airstrikes. And even if we were the ones fighting the Russians right now, the Russians have the most effective anti-aircraft systems in the world. We would be constantly contesting the airspace for superiority. It would not be something we could do easily. And so what he's saying about, oh yeah, we would do all this, it's not practical. It would not happen. To think that he's saying they're practically adapting, knowing full well that it would be a slugfest for us as a peer-to-peer challenger. He's insane. He's completely insane. And the way that he's saying, and I suspect he's been advising Sullivan on this too, just the way he's talking about this. And I know Petraeus has contacts with the White House. I think that he has somehow sold them a bill of goods, thinking that, oh yeah, just do it on the edges and just go through. But Petraeus knows full well that without a near peer, which would have to be us or the Chinese or all of NATO coming together, you're not going to be able to have carpet bombing or any such thing to penetrate those lines. It would be a slugfest based on the current circumstance.
I just want to switch gears and ask you a few questions based on your experience in military intelligence.
Sure.
Does the military spy on American civilians in America?
So I know I can comment on what we did and on what I think is going on now. So I was actively doing a number of operations which had domestic aspects to them. That is to say that we were going after bad guys, but some of the things we were doing were being observed by Americans. There was something called EO 12333, which Reagan signed into law, it's an executive order. He signed into effect. It still exists.
I'm very familiar with it. The intelligence community thinks it lets them do whatever the hell they want.
Well, not us. We were restricted to only being able, we intelligence officers had to tell, like if I was running an operation, you happen to be incidentally involved, I had to tell you I'm an intelligence officer. I had to say, look, I'm doing this.
Does the military spy on American civilians?
They don't, as far as I know. Now, NSA, because of Jim Clapper and others, opened that door on behalf of the FBI. So the military, NSA, National Security Agency, is a Title 10/Title 50 organization. It's a military organization. NSA does not, on its foreign intelligence mission, spy on Americans. With that said, they do take special taskings. Let me do the air quotes, special taskings from DHS and FBI to do things domestically, because they do own the full collection assets. And they have built something out west. Catherine Herridge did a report on this a few years ago, built these huge, under Keith Alexander, they built these huge repositories for data. And so the military does do general sweeping of all signals. and they're retained out there. So that while they don't spy, they have the capability to spy on Americans because of the nature of how they do collection, which I argued against. I don't think it's legal to sweep up everything. I've never believed that's legal. I've always said it's like trying to go after seven fish in the size of the Atlantic Ocean. You're not going to get them.
Correct.
Anyway, and they do special taskings for the FBI, which we do know they do, and for DHS. So those NSA is the conduit for that. And a friend of mine, Russ Tice, was a whistleblower back years ago, about the same time I was a whistleblower, and he talked about the fact that NSA had developed domestic spying capabilities based on domestic law enforcement agencies' requests. So that's a long answer. So the answer is they have the capability. They are not tasked to do it, but other agencies they work with do task them for the information that they need for domestic.
Suppose the military thought the president was mentally deficient. Would they spy on him?
Well, that's a tough question. I can tell you that the people I've worked with in the military at the senior level are very practical, and the requirement to serve the Constitution and Republic has always come first. And there has to be a clear prerogative that somehow there's a deviance from protecting the Constitution before they would ever spy on any public official. It'd have to be 7 days in May level, kind of incompetence to do something like that. I don't think they would do anything unless there's clearly an indication that the president is compromised to the level of selling out to another nation.
Tony Shaffer, always a pleasure, my dear friend. Thank you very much for joining us.
Good to be here. Thank
you. Scott Ritter in 25 minutes at 4:30 Eastern today. More, of course, as we get at Judge Napolitano for Judging Freedom.